Hey guys, got a little bit of a bonus lecture for this week with you guys working on midterms. I wanted to cover a topic that I think is important for ecologists and resource managers and other folks to have some understanding of. I think there's a lot of intersections with landscape ecology and the practice of conservation planning. So this is just an intro lecture on the open standards for the practice of conservation. It's a platform that I've worked with for over a decade that was originally developed by the Nature Conservancy, and I think you'll find it interesting and hopefully useful. So this presentation will focus on evidence-based management and adaptive management, the conservation standards and how they're being used globally, an overview of the newest version of conservation standards, and also some of the tools and support that's out there. So we'll start with that evidence-based and adaptive management cycle. So this concept of evidence in the evidence-based approach. So we know evidence is defined as relative information used to assess one or more hypotheses related to a question of interest. So in mature scientific fields such as medicine, engineering, education, the use of comprehensive evidence-based approaches is integrated into those fields. But in conservation, sources of evidence can sometimes be absent, they can be confusing or contradictory. Types of evidence can range from really high quality and reliable data to inference and even anecdotal information. So evidence is used throughout the conservation standards process to inform decisions. It's going to be used, for instance, to determine the project scope and what the key targets are for assessing the viability of those targets. It might be used for determining the presence or absence or status of some of the factors in a situation analysis or contributing factors in that analysis. It might be used to determine the causal relationships between key factors or influence our theory of change, including interaction between some of those factors. So it's always important to seek the best available evidence to support the project, and a thorough analysis of what's available is going to be important at the onset of a project. So this concept of adaptive management will come up again and again, but it's really rooted in the fact that a lot of our environmental challenges are urgent, that we don't always have perfect information in developing our strategies, that it's super important that we measure the strategies that we decide to implement, and that we continue to adapt our strategy with real-time information. We see this, these wheels of adaptive management cycles in all sorts of different processes that are iterative as ours is. And so this is the adaptive management cycle that has been adopted by the Open Standards. And it relays that we are in a cycle where we assess our scope and problem, we plan our strategies, we implement those strategies, we then have measurable outcomes that we assess and adapt. We share that information back with project teams and stakeholders and repeat the cycle. So you can kind of look at how the scientific method actually goes through the same iterative process as this adaptive management cycle. We'll talk a little bit about how the conservation standards have been applied globally. So the conservation standards have been used across the world in thousands of different projects by hundreds of practitioners and many, many organizations and agencies. A number of national protected area agencies have used the conservation standards to plan for place-based conservation. We've seen this in Chile, in Madagascar, and Mongolia. And so what kind of projects are appropriate for conservation standards? It's actually, there are a lot of different applications, and so we'll look at a few of those. So we've seen the open standards applied in the marine environment, such as in the Republic of Palau and in the Federated States of Micronesia, where the Nature Conservancy works with local communities there to protect reefs and fish stocks for livelihoods and for future generations. They've been applied to species-specific projects, such as in the mountains of Tanzania, where the Jane Goodall Institute is focused on working with chimpanzees. We've seen the open standards applied to thematic projects, such as a partnership called ROUTES, which is an acronym that stands for Reducing Opportunities for Unlawful Transport of Endangered Species. This organization seeks to disrupt wildlife trafficking in airports and seaports and warehouses. It's also being used to work on projects that are looking at how to improve production and consumption of commodities that can be harmful to the environment, like production of oil, palm, soy, and beef. Another thematic project that the open standards have addressed is looking at the challenge of dealing with climate mitigation and related energy policy and climate adaptation. And we've seen the open standards being used for other thematic projects, some of those addressing really high-level policy instruments like the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, that we see below, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, our CITES Act, or the Convention on Biological Diversity. And sometimes the open standards are used just for the strategic planning at the organizational level, how an organization can best meet their mission and what are the challenges and threats that impede an organization from meeting that mission. So the Conservation Partners, Conservation Measures Partnership has been developed, and it helps to continue to develop and maintain the practice of the conservation standards based on the work in the field of conservation. And in itself, this cycle of the conservation standards and improvements to it has also been iterative over the 20 years that it's been around. Some of the organizations that have been involved include Foundations of Success, the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, Africa Wildlife Fund, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and Conservation International. So to emphasize that iterative approach in the practice of conservation planning, you can see here sort of the evolution of the conservation standards from just the beginning of thought on this around 1998 until today with Conservation Standards 4.0. Part of this effort is supported by a network of coaches that are trained to facilitate open standards and to work with groups to implement this. I got trained as a coach, gosh, about a decade ago. And it looks like since then, the number of coaches has almost doubled globally. So let's talk through some of these steps in the process of conservation standards. That first step, to assess, really considers the current situation. It's a time when groups and stakeholders that are working on the topic gather together and take the time to collect information. So when we look at our wheel, we know that. So this first step in the conservation standards cycle is to assess. It's the time that we assemble the team that will be working on the assessment. We decide on the scope of the issue or geography that we're going to be working on. We identify the targets that are going to be really the emphasis of the project and what we focus our strategies on. We think about threats to those targets, and then we think through the conservation situation analysis. So, how do we scope a project? A lot of times we have a place-based scope of a project. It might be an ecoregion, a landscape, a priority area, or a discrete protected area with boundaries around it. Sometimes we have a target-based scope. That might be a species-oriented project or an assemblage of species or ecosystems. And as we said, we can also have thematic scopes. So projects based on specific threats or contributing factors or even strategies that we're oriented around. We know that spatial information is essential, and we'll talk more about that. So we'll periodically include notes about how to incorporate mapping and GIS into the conservation standards framework. But here are just some general considerations for incorporating mapping and GIS. Early on in the process, having the stakeholders and project team members get on the same page about the vision for the project can actually be more important than you might think. The vision statement describes what success looks like. An easy way to think about this is to think, if we look back on our project when it was finished, what would we want to see? So we usually want our vision statements to be relatively general so that lots of people can understand and identify with it. It should be visionary, it should be inspirational if possible, and it should be brief. The next step is really to clarify what the project is ultimately trying to conserve. So we call these values targets or conservation targets. A target is an element of biodiversity. They can include ecosystems, habitats, species, but we also have human well-being targets. So in the context of conservation projects, human well-being targets focus on components that impact humans by the status of the conservation targets. So they're aspects of social well-being that will be affected by the status of our conservation targets. It's important to work human well-being targets into the analysis so that we can articulate to stakeholders whose primary mission might not be around conservation or biodiversity. Human well-being targets can include things like livelihoods, being able to earn an income from fishing or timber, access to agricultural lands, health related to water quality, access and recreation, social cohesion, security from drought, disasters, and governance. Ecosystem services, a lot of times our human well-being targets flow from ecosystem services such as provisioning services for clean water and food, regulating services such as pollution, decomposition. Cultural services can include nature-inspired creativity, recreation, access, supporting services include photosynthesis and nutrient cycle. So the way we look at the flow from conservation targets to ecosystem services to human well-being is generally in this direction, that from our conservation targets we can articulate our ecosystem services, and then that human well-being scope is usually a response to maintaining those services. So one of the first things we think about is the viability of our targets. One of the first things that we do is measure the viability of our targets. We need to be able to understand what are the characteristics of our targets. We need to be able to assign metrics to understand exactly the extent and the condition of each of our targets that we've selected. And so it's important that we not select too many conservation targets when we're doing planning. 2 or 3 is usually ideal, because for each of those targets we're going to really dig in to get a better sense. And a lot of times we want our targets to be representative for a broader aspect of the community or system or target species that we're working with. We need to be able to understand in an evidence-based way the current status of our targets and be able to articulate what we think our future goals for those might be. So the next step in assessing our targets is thinking about what might be harming our targets. What is the scope and severity of some of the threats? So most of the threats we know are direct threats, or sometimes called pressures, are primarily from human activities. They can degrade the target viability. Things such as unsustainable fishing, unsustainable hunting, oil drilling, construction of roads, industrial wastewater, introduction of invasive species are all threats that we might identify. There are direct threats, but there can also be natural phenomena but altered by human activities such as increase in extreme storm events with climate change, increase in evaporation, or in rare cases, sometimes natural phenomena whose impact is increased by human activities, such as the potential for a tsunami that threatens the last remaining population of Asian rhinos. So in identifying threats, it's important to specify who the key actors are, who is imposing those threats, and being explicit about those actors can really help the team think about how to analyze the threat and a strategy. Sometimes the team may want to lump or split some of the threats depending on whether the actors are the same or not. And it can be important to clarify the nature of the threat or the degree of the threat. And it might also be important to focus on present and future threats. So in a threats analysis, we often go through a threat rating process. So after we've kind of brainstormed those activities that might be harming the conservation targets, we go through a prioritization process to determine which of the threats poses the largest challenge to our individual targets. And we use a standard criteria to evaluate the threats. So for a threat such as unplanned human-caused wildfire in a forest, first we define the scope or an area or a percent of the population that it impacts. We might determine the severity in which the fire impacts the targets in the area, and then finally we'll determine how long it'll take the target to recover from that threat, so whether or not that threat is irreversible. And then together we look at these and create a cumulative score for that threat. So one of the powerful things about the tools that we use in the conservation standards is the ability to actually rate the total impact of a single threat and think about its cumulative impact on the targets. So a wildfire threat may have a low impact on one of the conservation targets, such as black bears, but it might have a high impact on coniferous forests. And that might give us a cumulative impact that's medium. This is an example of a threats table where we rank a variety of threats, and we create a matrix and look at how those threats interact with the targets that have been selected. There's been a lot of thought in recent years about how to incorporate climate change into the open standards. Climate change doesn't really quite fit the definition of a threat, but it is a threat by convention, and it's something that requires the stakeholders to think through how the particular topic they're thinking about interacts with the changes that we anticipate with climate change, and then to kind of deconstruct that and incorporate it into the process and integrate it into the strategies. So situation analysis is when we analyze the conservation situation within our scope. So we'll review all the available evidence out there that helps us identify the key drivers of our direct threats. This process might include identifying and analyzing indirect threats as well, also known as root causes or drivers. We might think about unique opportunities that are part of the current situation, identify stakeholders that aren't at the table and their primary interests. And we use all that information to build really an interactive and sort of initial situation model that helps to narrate just the current status of that conservation situation. All right, so we'll talk through quickly a situation model for a hypothetical conservation project here. So in this case, we have Eastern Pacific sea turtles as the scope of our project, and our target within that scope is the sea turtles. The direct threat that we're dealing with in this case is turtle bycatch and longline fisheries. And the key drivers or the contributing factors of the threat are fishers using J hooks, the reluctance of fishers to change gear, traditional fishing methods, and there might be other factors contributing, but for now we'll keep it focused on these. So just to illustrate the point, let's think about two other factors at play here. The fact that sea turtle bycatch actually reduces fishing efficiency and that fishers don't actually want to harm sea turtles are important. When we recognize these two possible factors, we can also look at them as opportunities when it comes to brainstorming our strategies. All right, guys, so this is an example of a fully built out situation analysis for the Circle Hook Sea Turtle project, and I'll let you guys spend some time looking at that. So the next step is really about pausing and planning interventions based on the situation that we assessed in the first step. So the second step for planning includes developing goals and strategies, developing the theory of change around our strategies, monitoring those and setting up a protocol for how to measure and monitor the change that we hope will occur, and then creating a plan. So when we develop goals for our conservation targets, they should state our desired future status of those targets. We need them to be SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, and time-bound. After we've articulated our goals, we need to think about our strategies and how to articulate those strategies. So good strategic planning involves identifying who we need to influence and where and how we plan to intervene, as well where we will not plan to intervene. We'll use our situation analysis to find those key intervention points and then really do some deep diving on what existing strategies are out there for folks addressing similar threats. How do we generate some new strategies, and then how we go about selecting the optimal strategy. This work is also iterative. So in the case of the sea turtle bycatch, we know that our current situation is that we're losing too many sea turtles to sea turtle bycatch, that we envision a future where sea turtles are thriving and are no longer subject to bycatch and fishing, and that we need a strategy that bridges those two, the reality from our future goal. So in developing our strategies, we want to select a strategy that comes from the list of potential strategies that have been developed to build it out. We can do that by pulling the elements out of our situation model that might apply to that strategy, or we can build it from scratch. But we want our situation analysis really to complete the logic about how that particular intervention can directly impact a threat that we hope to address. So in the case of the sea turtle, we've got our situation model that we are able to convert to a theory of change. We're able to identify our intervention point, which is fishers that are using J hooks, and our strategy of testing and promoting circle hooks to reduce bycatch. And this gives us a sense of some of the symbology that we see with the open standards that is iterative, how we reflect targets, how we identify threats, how we look at our strategies and results. This really shows us how we can complete that cycle and what we hope that the future actions will be once the strategy is then implemented, and that we'll see fishers using circle hooks and fishers willing to change their gear. So now we're at the point where we want to implement our project. So in the phase of implementing, we might look at our theory of change. Again, we know what our strategy is, but we have to identify really what the steps are for implementing. So our strategy might mean that we're going to collaborate with academia and fisheries to develop a protocol to actually test circle hooks. And in doing so, we want to be able to evaluate circle hooks in long line fleets and really be able to articulate what that goal looks like in a smart way. So by July 2008, equal or better target catch and reduced turtle catch using circular hooks. So we really need a plan for how to bring this to action. One that identifies who's in charge of the tasks, what the cost is going to be, what the timeline is, and what we anticipate the output to be. In evaluating circle hooks in the Eastern Pacific, we've been able to articulate that goal by July 2008, equal or better target catch and reduced turtle catch using circular hooks. And in doing so, we can set up how we're going to measure that in order to be able to articulate that we've achieved that goal. And it's going to require having a system for reporting and having the scientists that are willing to analyze that information. So that brings us to the next step of analyzing and adapting. In this case, we are in a position to analyze our results. So the goal that by 2025, we'll have a 10% increase from 2005 in the levels of sea turtles. And then we've got the SMART objective of by January 2012, turtle capture rates will be less than 50% of 2005 rates. And we also have our objective that we already stated, that by July 2008, equal or better target catch and the reduced turtle catch using circular hooks. So were we able to meet those goals or not? We want to be able to look at the effectiveness of our strategy and being able to really understand and measure the outcomes. And then, most importantly, we want to be able to share that information after it's been analyzed. And we're going to do this through documentation and learning. So in this case, these scientists actually published the results of their study in the Journal of Biological Conservation. I want to talk a little bit about some of the tools that are out there for you guys to engage in the open standards and to explore some of it a little more. We mentioned the Coaches Network, so the Conservation Coaches Network support each other and provide ideas and a community of learning and conservation planning. There are resources for training and lots of guidance resources, including this PowerPoint that was openly available through the Conservation Coaches Network. There is specific software that actually uses that same symbology that we looked at before and includes templates for moving through the open standards process. And there's also a teaching network bringing this to universities. So this is a photo from one of the Conservation Coaches Network meetings in Spain that I actually had the opportunity to attend. So bonus points if you find me in that photo. I have a bright pink raincoat on. So there are lots of resources out there on the web that you can read through and think about if you're interested in going a little deeper into the practice of conservation planning through the open standards. These are just a few of those resources that you can find online that are readily available to you. And there is a network of folks focused on teaching conservation standards with an academic focus. It's called the Teaching Adaptive Management Network. So that TAM network serves faculty and staff and students, coaches who are involved and interested in conservation adaptive management, and full course